The traditional method of printing comics was crude and simplistic with no subtlety whatsoever. The colouring that they were doing in the 1930s was more or less the same format and style of colouring that we were using for the Watchmen 50, 60 years later in the mid-1980s. The cheapest method of reproduction was doing 4 separate plates with 3 colours and 1 key line for cheap comics. They would get a print out of each individual page, black and white page of the comic book, and then they would colour it up by hand and indicate where all the different colours went in printing ink. Yellow, red and blue. And the black was the key line, which is the drawing around all the colours. And it was a very, very simple and very cost-effective way of printing 4 colours. And that's the way the colouring has gone all the way up until the digital age, basically. Probably the mid-90s is when we started using digital to do colouring for comics. There was a sophistication to European storytelling that the American comics took a long time to catch up with. In France and Belgium and Holland, they had a very, very strong full-colour comic tradition. The stories might have got more and more sophisticated in America in the 1950s with EC Comics, which is a very, very important line of sort of classic horror SF comics. They still use a very traditional, recognisable format. The Americans have always traditionally just done children's comics for children as cheap as they possibly can, with no real consideration up until the last 20, 30 years of how good the paper is or how good the printing is and so on. British comics at that particular time, the standout and the highlight of so many different decades have been the Eagle. The Eagle was produced just after the war when colour printing was started to become quite cheap, and they decided to do the back cover and the front cover full colour, like a proper mature magazine, should we say. Most of British comics at that particular time were printed cheaply with no colour whatsoever, so the advantage that the Americans had, as cheap as their reproduction was for children's comics, they still had colour in it. 90% of all British comics at that time was black and white with very, very crude colour on the cover. Eagle was an exception to so many different rules, and the quality has never been surpassed in so many different ways. The standard of artwork and the storytelling is just so sophisticated, and that was done 40, 50 years ago. It just blows my mind every time I think of it, and Frank Hampson was a major influence on me. When I used to do colour comics, when I first started in the business, the effects that I was achieving there was with watercolour, airbrush, acrylic, coloured pencil, anything that would achieve a full colour finished effect. With digital colouring, you can achieve all of those effects digitally. You can do airbrush effects that you just would be so time consuming to do traditionally, you just would not be able to afford the time to do it. The whole setup for your studio would have to be completely and utterly different. You'd get particles of paint floating all around the place. You'd be breathing in this toxic paint. So digital is clean, it's fast, it's incredibly cost effective. The great thing about comics and comics colouring is how you can change the palette. To a certain extent, when you're working in comics, you want something bright, cheerful and open. If you're doing horror, you want the dirty greens and browns and purples and oranges to sort of, shock people. Blood red is always a great colour to throw onto a black and white page. The series I'm doing at the moment, which is Grey Suit, it has a very film noir type of muted palette again, but with splashes of very strong colour, particularly if we're going to use violence. Or we did one particular scene which is set in a hot country, so obviously we do yellows and warm oranges, warm colours and very pleasing colours combinations. When a scene is set back in the dark, dingy, misty London, we do greys, very muted blues and so on. So whenever we're approaching the storytelling, we do bear in mind what the story is about, and then we decide what is going to be a pleasing colour. So every single colour palette we try and choose is dictated by the story content. There's so many top quality professional colourists out there now who that is their job. One of my favourite colourists who I've worked with in the past is Matt Hollingsworth, and he was the colourist on Preacher, which was one of my favourite graphic series. Came out of DC Vertigo in the late 90s, I think it was. The way he coloured Preacher was just perfect for that particular approach to that sort of like storyline. But he's so versatile, he will like use a particular palette because it is required with that particular either genre, if it's horror or superhero. Matt will pick that particular way of approaching it. In the mid-80s, the Americans, DC in particular, were coming over to pick up British creators, basically. Alan Moore had gone over a couple of years previously and changed the world of the Swamp Thing. And Alan had proven that sort of like, coming from a different background, coming from different literary influences, you could look at traditional American comics and change them completely, almost unrecognisably. Dave had been doing Green Lantern Corps for them as well, so they were quite well established at DC. So they asked them both if they would like to do something different for themselves. So the great thing about The Watchmen is they treated the superhero genre like a proper grown-up novel. And that's what Dave and Alan did. The fact that I'd been working with Dave on and off, and Alan, so like Alan was writing lots of Future Shocks for me and I was doing loads of stuff with both of them. So we were basically a team of people who liked working with each other, and we were quite closely related to each other. So Dave wanted to make sure he sort of like kept it in-house type of thing. So he wanted to deal with people who he cared about and enjoyed working with. So he asked me to become involved, and it was, for me, it was just changed things on its head. The Watchmen turned me into a recognisable international name, mainly with new clients, and I became known at DC, which was a stepping stone into the American market, which gave me the career I've got today. To work within the very highly limited traditional American reproduction method that they had in those days, it was so limiting. I just found it mind-blowing that we were trying to do something so sophisticated, yet we weren't allowed to do it in a different format than the one we were doing it in. So I decided that we had to like use colour in a way that hadn't been done before. Dave and Alan all along had said they wanted the colouring to be more European, so that was the starting point. We weren't going to do it as a traditional American four-colour comic. Alan and Dave had colour ideas, and they did want colour to be a very, very important part of it. And they wanted the scenes separated, which created a real problem when it came to finding different colour keys because of the limitations of the colour palette. And that's something we strived on. And that really dictated why the secondary colours became a major part of the palette. Everyone knows if you look at something bright, cheerful and striking, you know, it appeals, it attracts. If you look at something muted, dark and down, it will make you go down. So we know colour affects you in that way. That's a scientific fact. I thought, okay, if we're going to approach it this way and use colour to engender emotion, let's really go for it big time. So it became almost abstract. If you flash a page of Watchmen colour at someone, they would know without even reading the title it was the Watchmen colouring because it was so stylised. There's nothing naturalistic about it, and we were just going for emotion. So when we did the Absolute Edition 25 years later, I had the opportunity to digitalise all the colouring. And I could have done anything I wanted, but Dave decided we were going to stick to the original format, which I was very happy about in the end.